Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Uh, I, just, I actually will start off with your reference to McCarthyism. You sometimes see what I would call overwrought metaphors used to describe the marketplace of ideas. Um, you hear McCarthyism, your former colleague Jordan Peterson likes to talk about cultural Marxism. People talk about Big Brother. I generally avoid terms like that because all of those terms suggest a kind of top-down totalitarian framework for controlling ideas. And what I've observed as a journalist, and maybe what some people here have observed as academics, is that's not really the way the model usually works now. It's mostly lateral. It's what I would call crowdsourced self-censorship, where people are maybe afraid to talk about ideas, including some what I would regard as some fairly obvious ideas, because they fear the judgment of their colleagues. And the sanction that they fear isn't necessarily, I mean, sometimes it is, but usually it's not formal sanction. It's more like ostracism or being not granted tenure or not having your contract fulfilled or something like that. And to a person who's in that position, yeah, that can feel Big Brother-ish. It can feel McCarthyist. I mean, in McCarthyism, not all of the sanctions were formally exerted by the government. In some cases, like for instance, the film industry, you had skilled directors who simply didn't get work. That to me would be an appropriate analogy. But let me get into a little bit of that later in my remarks. So if it's okay, I'll speak for 15 or 20 minutes and then we'll do some withering Q&A.
Counting on you.
So as noted in the introduction, I've worn a bunch of different hats as a journalist. None as august as the gentleman who introduced me, who was at NPR and CBC and probably a whole bunch of acronyms he didn't even mention to me. In my case, I worked at the National Post. I was a managing editor and a columnist, and my byline still appears there. I became an editor-in-chief at a Toronto-based magazine. And now I do podcasts for Quillette. I'm an editor. And I wouldn't say I planned any of this. I kind of stumbled ass backwards through my journalism career, just taking advantage of opportunities. And I think I'm a fairly intellectually curious person. And that's kind of just, I let my intellectual curiosity guide my career path. And my current role at Quillette, which is, as noted, an Australian-based publication, where I spend a lot of my time as an investigative reporter focusing on scandals in higher education, it's not really different from that. It's something I just kind of stumbled into. I didn't set out to become an investigative reporter. I actually became an investigative reporter fairly late in my career, in my late 40s. And I certainly didn't say, oh, I'm going to become an investigative reporter in higher education. And if you said 20 years ago to me, that's what I was going to become, I'd say, my God, that's boring. But I didn't realize what was going to become of higher education. And the reason I kind of fell into this role is kind of because nobody else was doing it. There were all these academics, not just in Canada, in the United States. I've done stories on British academics and Australian academics, but I happen to live in Toronto, so I'm doing, there's some who live in my neighborhood. I've gotten some stories at the deli. And as a result, a lot of these stories that get told to me are like people who say, hey, I talked to the Toronto Star, I talked to the Globe, no one wants to pick up the story because of the politics involved. And I started to say, well, okay, I'll do the story. It's a great story. And then I started getting a reputation as somebody who would cover scandals in Canadian academia. And before you know it, everyone with a bunch of letters after their name was telling me what was going on in their department. So a lot of this just happened by accident. And I don't have time to talk about all my stories, though I'd love to. But instead, and this is on the suggestion of the organizers, I'm going to talk about one particular story that I did last year. It's probably the longest story I ever did. Probably took a month to research. So this was the story. How many people here are familiar with the, I don't know what to call it, the non-sex ring scandal at McMaster University in 2020? How many people, I know there's one or two people who are extremely familiar with it, but so I'll just give you the bare bones of this. In 2020, McMaster University in Hamilton, of course, became completely embroiled with these explosive allegations that there was a sex ring being run out of the psychology department. It's actually formerly known as the PNB department, it's a psychology, neuroscience, and behavior. And according to these accusations, which in retrospect seem completely false, as indeed they were, you had multiple professors who were conspiring in a vast Jeffrey Epstein-like sex conspiracy involving gang rape and kind of de facto sex dungeons and electronic mind control. And these, in retrospect, again, these seem quite fantastical, kind of like the demonic ritual sex abuse cases from the 80s and 90s. I don't know if people remember that. But people took it seriously. And there was a whole social panic that unfolded on McMaster's campus. And at the height of this social panic, no fewer than 7 scholars from the psychology department were being investigated. And some had their offices ransacked. And this part really is McCarthyist. There was one professor I spoke with. I mean, they going through his garbage can and they had Post-it notes in a little plastic bag. It was like one of those drug raids from the Jazz Age. It was a true moral panic, and several of the 7 people being investigated were women, including the wife and girlfriend of 2 of the people who were accused of like luring women into the sex dungeons. And in one case, I think she wasn't allowed to go on campus. There were posters put up, like, you know, if you see this person, don't panic, call campus security. These people had their reputations dragged through the mud. And again, it was all completely false. But one detail of the story which really stuck out to me is that the president of the university himself is still the president. His name is David Farrar. He lent his name to this panic, and he put out a campus-wide email blast, basically giving credence to the social panic that was playing out. And I learned during the course of my investigation that the allegations of this Epstein-like sex ring, it basically originated with 2 women. One of the women had her claims completely demolished in open court during criminal court proceedings in which the defendant was acquitted. The other woman confessed during the process. University officials knew full well about it. The other woman confessed that she had been in the throes of a psychotic episode and had just binge watched Netflix's documentary on Jeffrey Epstein and imagined that similar events were happening at McMaster University because she was in a state of mental health crisis. This was actually known during the investigation. The university plowed ahead with the investigation anyway. It shows you the level of scrutiny they applied before throwing people off campus and such. So it was a full-blown witch hunt. I could stand here and talk for an hour about this case. It's actually, a lot of the details are still fresh in my mind, and it's infuriating because I talked to some of the victims of this witch hunt, which actually, you know, the more I talk, the more you're right about the McCarthyist thing. It really does sound like something out of the McCarthy area. But for our purposes, the detail that's really interesting about this story is how I got this story in the first place. Because some of the sources I spoke to at McMaster, because to do a story like this, you need a lot of sources. Some of them spoke to me on the record, some of them didn't. And some of the sources I spoke to were very candid. They said, you know, John, Quillette wasn't our first choice for the story, and which is humbling. But it makes sense because it's a Canadian story. It's an academic story. So the people who were trying to get the truth out, the truth being that this was a witch hunt and a social panic as opposed to an Epstein-like sex dungeon story, they had tried to get local newspapers interested. They had tried to get Canadian journalists interested. I live in Canada, but I guess I'm an Australian journalist because I work for Quillette. And they couldn't get local journalists to bite on this story because it was seen as ideologically off message. It was seen like, well, McMaster is saying there's this rape culture situation. The administration, the president is suggesting there might be this like vast sex conspiracy on campus, rape culture, Me Too. And now you folks are coming forward and saying, no, no, it's all nonsense. It's ideologically off message. It's politically inconvenient, and the story wasn't picked up. So it fell to me, essentially an Australian journalist, working at an outlet based a 22-hour plane ride away, 15,000 kilometers away from McMaster. It fell to me to tell the story of how McMaster's 2020 sex panic unfolded. And I think that fact tells you a lot about the state of journalism in Canada, that someone like me would have to tell the story. Now, I absolutely don't want to suggest that Canadian journalists aren't interested in investigative journalism, or that they're not interested in doing the hard work necessary to break big stories or get scoops. However, increasingly, the kind of investigative stories they're interested in doing are stories where they know that the outcome is going to be that the bad guy is such and such, and they know that the conclusions are going to be ideologically on message to what is expected within their newsrooms. That it's a story about racism, or it's a story about sexism, or some such, or maybe it's an investigation of a big corporation. And by the way, those are valuable and important investigative topics. And I don't want to take away from all that. But it's impossible to do proper investigative journalism if your interest in the story is conditional on who the bad guy in the story is going to be. And you have to follow the facts where they take you. And if you say, well, I'm only interested in this story if it gets to be a social justice morality tale, it's not really investigative journalism. It means you have a story to tell, and you're weaponizing the tools of investigative journalism to tell it, but you're only interested in it insofar as a pre-scripted narrative comes out of it. Now, I've talked about this kind of thing on social media with other journalists. There's an active dialogue among lots of journalists. There's this thing called Twitter where we talk about this stuff. I've been known to use it sometimes. And when this issue gets discussed, you often hear conservatives say, well, what we really need is for these young investigative journalists to be courageous. They need to grow a pair. They need to like tell their colleagues to screw off and it's gonna follow the truth where it leads and be a hard-nosed 20th century style reporter with the fedora and working your sources down at the docks and like all these sort of romanticized figures from out of the mudracker age that we often associate with investigative journalism. And I always tell them, like, it's not that simple. Like, none of us are characters in an Ayn Rand novel. We all are sensitive to the judgment of our peers. And if our peers are telling us, hey, you got to be on the right side of history, got to support Black Lives Matter and Me Too and reconciliation and all the rest, and your little investigation is off message from that, and you've got your editors and your colleagues and people telling you that your investigation is making them uncomfortable, there's not a lot of people who are going to be able to resist that pressure, especially if you're early in your career. And so I understand why, especially younger journalists, are vulnerable to self-censorship and to resisting stories that they think could lead them to politically incorrect conclusions. And I get it why certain young reporters at, say, the Hamilton Spectator, which had a chance to break this scoop at McMaster, but didn't, I can see why they were nervous about this story. I often tell people, so put yourself in the shoes of a young journalist. Not, by the way, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. There's all sorts of great young journalists whose work I admire. And in fact, I try and recruit them to write for Quillette. But I have some experience in this milieu. You've got a young journalist who's just graduated from college. And all her life, she's been told that walking on the side of angels means believing women and uncritically amplifying the voices of oppressed people, a category that is broadly defined, and working on their reconciliation and acknowledging their white privilege. In this example, the person is white. And more than that, they're told that truth is a subjective phenomenon and that everybody has their own truth. And that insisting on objective truth makes you somebody who's exhibiting white privilege or worse. And so that's the message they get all through university. And then suddenly they become a rookie reporter at a newspaper. And suddenly they're told, hey, congratulations, you're on the investigative desk. You're this hard-bitten reporter, you don't trust anybody. You don't believe anybody. You want to see the documents. You want to see the proof. You're skeptical of everything. Suddenly you're in a position where objective proof is really, really meaningful. And there's a kind of cognitive dissonance that, and I've seen this in younger colleagues, especially when I worked at, it was a magazine I worked at. I have some memorable experiences where you can actually see on their face a kind of cognitive dissonance where they're being pulled in two directions at once. On their social media feeds and in their progressive ideological silos, basically one and the same thing, they're being told all the slogans, you know? But then their boss, somebody like me, it's like, forget the slogans. The job here is to get the truth, follow the story where it leads. And that can be a very painful experience for somebody who's trying to please their friends on Twitter and trying to remain on side of fashionable political ideologies, and is also trying to obey the traditional conventions of the journalistic trade, which do require objective truth, and which do require that you don't just believe anyone, whether they're women or men or white or black or straight or gay. Everybody lies. It's one of the first things you learn in journalism. Dishonesty has no skin color and it has no sex. Everyone lies. That's why you have to be that hard-bitten 20th century style reporter who doesn't care about the subjective feelings of people who are telling you things that aren't true. And there's an economic dimension to this too. And this is another reason I'm sympathetic with younger journalists. When I served my time at this Toronto-based magazine, it was very much focused on arts and activism. The younger workers, the younger writers who I commissioned, we paid $1 a word, the same rate people got 30 years ago. By the way, shows you the economics of journalism. You know, try paying your contractor the same wages that contractors got 30 years ago and see if he fixes your deck. These are people who don't make a lot of money. They are in an insecure trade that's contracting. They're getting $1 a word, so like a 5,000 word article, which might take them 3 months to do. You know, they're basically getting the amount of money they get working at a fast food restaurant. And even editors and staff members aren't getting a lot of money. The idea that, well, these people are gonna develop middle-class incomes and buy homes with the money they're gonna get working as a line editor for a magazine is kind of laughable. And so they know that in order to stay even in the penumbra of the writing trade, they're gonna have to eventually develop side gigs or full-time gigs as university lecturers teaching creative writing or whatnot. They're going to have to get government grants. They're going to have to sit on arts councils. They're going to have to become curators at literary festivals. You know, there's a whole kind of ecology of jobs available to high concept writers in Canada that if you stitch them all together, you can kind of make what might pass for a middle class income. But all of these things that I just described have gatekeepers, ideological gatekeepers who read your byline, who read your social media, who know if you've written a problematic article that's gotten one of their friends in trouble, or that's off message, according to one of the progressive dogmas that's happens to be in fashion. And so from a purely economic point of view, self-preservation, if you're a young journalist, you can't just say be courageous, like, well, what, be courageous and I can't pay my mortgage? There's a lot of young journalists that if certainly smart enough to have written the McMaster story that I wrote, but that story might have ended their career. I am in a privileged position that I can follow the facts. I'm middle-aged. I work for an outlet on the other side of the world. I don't go to dinner parties where people sit in judgment of me in a way that will affect my career. I can afford to come here and speak my mind and laugh things off. If I were half my age, I wouldn't be doing that. So I reject the conservative argument that these people are somehow not brave, or that they lack courage, or that they're not smart enough to do good investigation. Of course they're smart enough to. Most of the people I worked with this highly progressive magazine were smarter than me. Many of them were better reporters than me. I just happened to have the good fortune of being in a position in life where I was able to then go work for an outlet that allowed me to pursue investigative stories to their conclusion and report those conclusions, however politically incorrect they were. And one thing I hasten to add is that I'm not here to kvetch. I'm not saying I'm a victim of woke culture or I've been canceled or anything like that. This isn't like, do we still use that term canceled? Like, it just seems very 2022. I'm not here to complain about wokeness, another word like we're all tired of. If anything, I'm a profiteer of the phenomenon I'm describing. Because if it weren't for this culture of self-censorship that exists in Canadian journalism, I wouldn't be getting these great stories. And by the way, these stories, I'd like to believe they're important. They're also incredibly satisfying professionally to work on. Investigative journalism is what gets me up in the morning. I absolutely love doing it. And the lifeblood of investigative journalism is getting scoops and having sources trust you. And I don't care if the sources come to me and say, hey, you weren't my first choice. I said, I don't care, you're here, you'll do. Like, and so, I wouldn't say I'm cheering this phenomenon on, because I find censorship, whether it's top-down censorship of the Big Brother variety or self-censorship, is always an illiberal phenomenon. Witch hunts are fundamentally illiberal. And so, I hasten, sometimes I'm at a loss for words to describe the kind of phenomena that I cover on campuses, what's happened at McMaster. I call them social panics, I call them witch hunts. Sometimes I've referred to them as progressive ideological manias gone haywire, but even the word progressive doesn't really feel right, because the term progressive, I associate it with people who are trying to make the world a better place and to help genuinely socioeconomically deprived people. But the phenomenon you're describing is essentially ideological puritanism and status seeking among upper middle class white collar workers, of whom universities are full. I mean, that's why the problem is so great at universities, is because, look at us, like, this isn't Canada. This is a group of people who can afford to sit around and talk about things like pronoun policy and then ostracize the guy who isn't on board. So, I'm highly aware that it would be intellectually dishonest for me to play the victim on all of this, or even to complain too much about it, because even I would say conservatives in general, because one thing I've left out of this discussion is there is a conservative media in Canada. Toronto Sun is conservative, National Post is somewhat conservative. There's a website called Post Millennial, which is conservative, but they don't get these stories either. Because if you're a conservative outlet, running cover stories about how, like, Justin Trudeau is a libtard or whatever, you're not going to be interested in sending one of your reporters to do a month-long investigation of the psychology department of some thumb-sucking department, like, at a research university. That's your reporters aren't interested in that kind of story. Your writers aren't interested in that kind of story. One of the reasons I'm lucky is Quillette is a kind of intellectual black turtleneck publication written and read by exactly the kind of privileged people who can afford to sit around and talk about things like the ideological climate on universities. And combination of people who have that interest and have bosses on the other side of the world who will let me spend a month investigating a university that she's never heard of. She lives in Australia. It's like we're talking about Kangaroo University in Australia, where like, I've never heard of it. I said, there's this fantastic story at McMaster, and she trusts me and says, okay, great. I said, well, it's gonna take me a month. She says, okay. There's gonna be a lot of legal issues, big lawyer bills. She says, okay. There are very few journalists in Canada who have that kind of long leash that allow them to report this kind of story. Perhaps some of you are thinking, but wait a sec. There are plenty of reporters in Canada who cover the education beat. Not as many as there were 10 or 20 years ago, because there's not that many beat reporters left in Canada. Most reporters who are left at newspapers are what are known as general assignment reporters, which means they cover whatever's in the top 20 hit-getting topics. So every newsroom now has a big TV screen where it shows you what the top hit-getting articles on your website are, and every reporter wants to chase those stories because they know they'll get tons of hits. So that's kind of the way stories are staffed these days. But there are reporters in Canada who specialize in the field of education, and to be fair, who do valuable work in breaking stories. I'm certainly not the only journalist in Canada who breaks stories about education, but it's important to think about what it means to cover higher education in 2024, because in many cases, it basically means that you have an array of contacts among the enormous staff of professional communications officials who now populate the administrative offices of modern universities. And they're constantly feeding you puff stories about their latest celebrity academic, or their latest DEI initiative, or their latest advertising campaign. And it's very easy to cover those stories, right? Because if you look at the in-house propaganda publications that universities publish now, they're more professional than Canadian journalistic publications. They probably have bigger staffs. They certainly have better photographers. And so if you're an education reporter, you're dealing every day with these publicists, and they're just giving you a steady stream of, I wouldn't call them scoops because they're more promotional fare that the university puts out, but they're legitimate stories. And then again, the economics come in. If you're an education reporter who is facing your company's 15th round of layoffs, and you know that your time is coming, and you also know that if you're going to keep paying your mortgage after the layoff, it's probably going to be because you become like assistant VP comms at your local community college or whatnot. Are you really going to do a lot of stories about how that community college is scandal plagued, or about how the president promoted false allegations and some sexual harassment scandal? You're probably going to play ball, and you develop relationships with the people at these universities, and it's more lopsided. I mean, if you go on your phones and you Google employees, people who are employed in journalism versus people who are employed in corporate communications, you will find it looks like an old-fashioned supply and demand curve, where the number of actual working journalists in newsrooms has been going down. It's the demand curve. And the people who are employed in corporate communications, and I would include university communications, is going up. That's why a lot of journalism schools don't call themselves journalism schools anymore. They call themselves, like, I don't know, communication schools or or whatnot, because it takes heed of the fact that most of their graduates aren't going to be journalists. They're going to be working for publications such as the in-house publications put out by universities. That's where a lot of the jobs are. And by the way, in some cases, those are real journalistic jobs. I don't want to demean them, but in some cases, it's essentially advertorial. One problem I face, because I said I was like a profiteer of this phenomenon, I would say that I now get more scoops from Canadian universities about scandals than I can actually write about. So if you follow my Twitter account, which I do not recommend, it's very problematic, you will see that sometimes I'll just like, after I verify the authenticity of some screenshot or some document dump that I got from some university, I don't have time to write these all up as stories. So I will just put on Twitter, I'll say, look at this document I got, or, just by way of example, this is a random example. These are random examples plucked from the day or two before I came here. Someone at Ryerson University, which is now called Toronto Metropolitan University because we realized that Ryerson is history's greatest monster. I got their internal correspondence about how scholars in the sociology department at TMU are searching for Zionists, or what one of them charmingly referred to Zios, a term I'd never heard before. The same day I got documents from York University, where the scholars now have something called a Palestinian Solidarity Committee. I got the report from the Palestinian Solidarity Committee, which has not been publicly released, which proposes to eliminate anonymous faculty voting on the basis that they want to know who in the department is voting against the wishes of the Palestinian Solidarity Committee so they can be reported to the administration and punished. Again, this story, as shocking as it was to me, was not even of an order that I could report because I was working on bigger stories. This is what my life is now, because every time I tweet something like this, there are 10 Canadian academics who say, oh, this is a guy I can use to publicize information that I have about scandals unfolding on my campus in a way that doesn't get in the way of my tenure. Because there's a lot of academics who want to make noise about this. And this is actually one thing I highlight. It's like conservatives lampoon academia in Canada and otherwise as being like full of febrile Marxist activists who all they want to do is destroy capitalism, free Julian Assange, and return our economy to like some pre-industrial agrarian utopia. That is 100% not true. In my experience, 99% of academics, they just want to do their work. If they study mollusks, they just want to study mollusks. And to the extent they come to me because they complain, it's not because they're conservatives. They don't want their campus to be like taken over by, Polyev or something like that. Almost all of my sources, including every source I had for my McMaster story, was a political progressive, an old-fashioned liberal, mugged by reality, as they say. And they're not looking to get their colleagues fired because, every department has some in-house enforcer who's always monitoring everyone's pronouns and the positionality of their praxis and the praxis of their positionality or whatever nonsense they're talking about. They just want those people off their back so they can study mollusks. That's why they got into molluscology or whatever. Like that's what they want to do. And maybe 10 years ago, they were able to study mollusks. You're getting up because I've talked to him.
I'm getting up, yeah.
Okay. He's getting up. By the way, when I read this out on the subway, it was like 4 minutes. So I'm going to sum up in one long run-on sentence. Oh, you know about that. So one thing I want to emphasize is in terms of the solution, like I'm not, in the United States, you've got conservatives who say, well, the solution to this is we're going to pass laws telling university professors what they can teach. They say you can't teach critical race theory. Rubio tried this in Florida. It was a disaster. I don't want that. I wouldn't want a conservative telling university professors what they can teach any more than I would want a progressive Puritan. What I would like to see is healthy intellectual pluralism, old-fashioned liberal values, return to campus culture. And I say that against my own selfish interest because I'm going to get a lot fewer scoops. On the other hand, magnanimously, I think it would be better for society at large. And so on that broad-minded note, I will abruptly bring my remarks to a conclusion. Thanks.
I will take your criticism.